My mom stole my college fund to fulfill a whim my sister, so I made her pay, and now she's begging for forgiveness. And I wasn't sure I wanted to tell this story, but the more I think about it, the more I need to. It's not just about one bad day. It's about years of being pushed aside until I finally snapped. So here goes. A few weeks ago, I turned 18, the big milestone. You know, the one everyone says is supposed to be special, adulthood, freedom, all that. I had it all planned out, just a simple get-together with a few friends at my house. Pizza, snacks, music, maybe a couple of board games. I'm not someone who likes big parties or tons of attention, so this felt perfect. Small, easy, and fun. At least, that's what I hoped. But nothing went the way I imagined. In fact, my 18th birthday turned out to be one of the worst days of my life, and it still stings to think about it. To really understand, I need to give you some context. My name is Anna, and I live with my mom, Margaret, and my younger sister, Samantha. I'm 18, Sam is 16, and even though she's only 2 years younger, it feels like she runs the house. Samantha has always been outgoing, bubbly, and charming in a way I could never be. She can talk her way into or out of anything, and she knows how to get exactly what she wants. Mom calls her her little twin, and it's not just because they look alike. It's because Sam can do no wrong in her eyes. Me? I'm the strong one, the one who doesn't need help, the one Mom doesn't have to worry about. I've heard it so many times I've lost count. Ever since my dad passed away 3 years ago, that's been my role. Don't get me wrong, I loved my dad more than anything. He was the one person who really saw me for who I was. Dad made sure I felt special. He supported my love of art, always encouraged me to keep drawing and painting even when I doubted myself. He made me feel like I mattered. But since he's been gone, everything changed. Mom and Samantha became this inseparable team, this unbreakable little unit. Shopping trips, movie marathons, weekend getaways to nearby towns. And me? I was always left behind, expected to figure things out on my own because Anna's mature. Anna's responsible. I hate that word. Mature. It's just another way of saying you're on your own. Anyway, back to my birthday. I woke up feeling hopeful, actually excited. It wasn't anything fancy, but I'd invited my friends over for 6 o'clock. I'd even used my own savings to buy snacks and soda since I didn't want to ask Mom for money. She'd been so busy with Samantha lately that asking for anything felt pointless. When I came downstairs that morning, I could hear laughter from the kitchen. Samantha was there, of course, gushing to Mom about how excited she was for some concert that evening. "This is going to be the best night ever," she said, practically bouncing as she poured herself cereal. "I can't believe we got tickets so close to the stage." I stopped in the doorway, my stomach sinking. "Wait, tonight?" I asked, looking between them. Samantha turned to me with this smug little smile. "Yeah, Anna. Tonight." "What? You forgot. Mom and I are going to see Silver Silence." I didn't care about the band. I barely even knew who they were, but the realization hit me like a punch in the gut. They were leaving on my birthday. "You're going to a concert tonight?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I looked at Mom. "But today's my birthday." Mom glanced up from her coffee, looking almost annoyed that I interrupted their conversation. "We didn't forget, Anna. We'll celebrate later. This concert is a big deal for your sister. You're mature enough to understand that, right?" That word again. Mature. Like my feelings didn't matter because I was old enough to get over it. Samantha just grinned, like she'd won some competition I didn't even know I was part of. "Sorry, Anna," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "Maybe next time." Next time? This wasn't about next time. It was my 18th birthday. I wanted to scream at both of them, to say, "What about me? What about what I want?" But I didn't. I knew it wouldn't change anything. They'd still walk out that door, leaving me behind because, once again, I didn't matter as much. Instead, I turned and left the room. Mom called after me, but I ignored her. I went back to my room, slammed the door, and sat on my bed, staring at the wall. I felt stupid for expecting anything different. The day dragged on. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the house, rearranging the snacks I'd bought, and setting up the living room like I'd planned. But every time I heard Samantha's excited voice floating down the hallway, it chipped away at me. At 5 o'clock, I heard them getting ready to leave. Samantha was laughing as she tried on different outfits, shouting down the hall to Mom about which jacket looked best. I stayed in my room, refusing to come out. "Bye, Anna," Samantha yelled as they walked out the door. Mom didn't even say goodbye. I listened as their car pulled out of the driveway, then silence. Just me and an empty house. I sat in the living room and stared at the snacks I'd set out: chips, soda, a couple of pizzas I'd ordered earlier. It all felt pointless now. My friends texted me asking when to come over, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't want to have to explain why my mom and sister weren't even there. Eventually, I turned off my phone, curled up in Dad's old recliner, and pulled one of his sweatshirts over me. It still smelled faintly like him, even after all these years. I held onto it like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I thought about how things used to be when he was here. Dad would have baked me a cake, probably a lopsided one because he was terrible at baking. We would have watched one of his favorite old movies together, the kind with cheesy action scenes and dramatic music. And even though it wouldn't have been anything fancy, I would have felt special. Now I felt invisible. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up hours later with a stiff neck and swollen eyes. I glanced at the clock. It was after midnight. My birthday was over. For the first time in a long time, I let myself cry, really cry. I felt angry, hurt, forgotten, all at once. I cried until I couldn't anymore, until all that was left was this empty, hollow feeling in my chest. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a mess. My face was puffy, my head was pounding, and I couldn't shake the thought that my family didn't care about me at all. I stayed in bed for as long as I could, trying to avoid reality. Then the doorbell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. I groaned, dragging myself out of bed. I thought maybe it was Mom and Samantha coming home early, though I wasn't ready to face them yet. But when I opened the door, I froze. Standing on the porch was Uncle Greg. He looked at me, concern written all over his face. "Happy belated birthday, kiddo," he said, stepping inside like he belonged there. I didn't know it yet, but Uncle Greg showing up that day was about to change everything. The moment Uncle Greg stepped into the house, it was like someone had opened a window and let the air back in. He dropped his duffel bag on the floor, took one look at me, and frowned. "You look like you've had a rough couple of days, kiddo," he said. I managed a weak shrug, trying to avoid his gaze. "I'm fine." He gave me one of those looks, half disbelief, half concern, that only Uncle Greg could pull off. "Fine. Huh? You look like you've been through the ringer." I didn't know how to respond, so I just stood there awkwardly. Uncle Greg sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, like he was figuring out what to say next. Finally, he patted the back of the old recliner where I'd spent most of the night. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I shook my head, still confused about why he was even here. Uncle Greg had always been my favorite relative growing up. He was my dad's younger brother, and he used to visit all the time. Back when Dad was still alive, Uncle Greg would show up with bags of candy and cheap dollar store toys, saying things like, "Don't tell your mom, but I'm the fun uncle." After Dad passed, though, things changed. Mom stopped inviting him over, and eventually, I just stopped seeing him. I always assumed it was because seeing Uncle Greg reminded her too much of Dad. Now here he was, sitting in Dad's old chair, and looking at me like he was trying to read my mind. "So," he started slowly, "are you going to tell me what's going on? Or do I have to guess?" I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Uncle Greg raised an eyebrow. "Your grandma called me. She told me your mom and Samantha left you on your own for your birthday. Is that true?" My face flushed, and I looked down at the floor, suddenly embarrassed. I didn't want to cry again, not in front of him. "It's not a big deal," I mumbled. "They just forgot, I guess." Uncle Greg let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "Not a big deal? Anna, they ditched you on your 18th birthday. You're allowed to be upset about that." I didn't know what to say. For so long, I'd been told I was mature and strong, and part of me felt like crying about it would prove everyone wrong. But Uncle Greg didn't look like he was going to let this go. "You know what?" he said suddenly, sitting up straighter. "Grab your shoes." I blinked. "What?" We're getting out of here, he said. You need some fresh air and a change of scenery. You're not spending one more second sitting in this empty house feeling miserable. I can't just leave, I said, startled. Why not? You're 18 now. That means you get to decide for yourself, he said matter-of-factly. Come on, let's go. I stared at him, hesitant. But what if Mom comes back? She's going to freak out if I'm gone. Uncle Greg's face darkened. Good. Maybe she needs a wake-up call. There was something about the way he said it, so calm and firm, that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, he was right. For once, I didn't owe Mom or Samantha an explanation. I owed myself something instead. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my shoes, threw on a hoodie, and followed Uncle Greg outside. We ended up at this old diner on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, just one of those places with cracked red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. But it felt comforting in a way I couldn't explain. Uncle Greg ordered us burgers, fries, and milkshakes without even asking what I wanted. Trust me, he said with a wink. You'll feel better with some food in your stomach. For the first time in what felt like days, I let myself relax. Uncle Greg did most of the talking, telling me ridiculous stories about him and my dad growing up. Like the time they tried to build a treehouse and ended up breaking half the tools in their dad's shed. Or the time they snuck into a movie theater and got caught because my dad accidentally dropped an entire bag of popcorn. I laughed in spite of myself. It felt weird, good weird, to laugh again. Your dad was a knucklehead, Uncle Greg said, shaking his head with a grin, but he loved you more than anything. You know that, right? I nodded, my throat tight. Yeah, I know. He set his milkshake down and looked at me seriously. He wouldn't have wanted this for you, Anna. Sitting in that house, feeling like you don't matter. That's not what he wanted. I stared at the table, picking at the edge of a napkin. I don't think Mom sees it that way, I said quietly. It's like, I don't exist to her anymore. Everything's about Samantha. Uncle Greg's expression softened. That's not okay. And it's not your fault either. You know that, right? I shrugged. It doesn't matter. What can I even do about it? He leaned back, crossing his arms. You don't have to do anything. I'm here now, and I'm not going to let them treat you like this anymore. I looked up at him, surprised. What do you mean? Uncle Greg took a long sip of his milkshake and said, I mean you're coming to stay with me for a while. You need a break from that house, and I think your mom needs a reality check. My heart skipped a beat. Stay with you? He nodded. Yeah, I've got a spare room. You can take some time to figure out what you want to do next. You don't owe anyone an explanation for needing space, Anna, especially not after the way they've been treating you. Part of me wanted to say yes right away, but another part of me hesitated. What if it makes things worse? Uncle Greg shrugged. Then it makes things worse. Sometimes you've got to stir the pot a little to get people to see what's really going on. I couldn't help but smile. That sounded exactly like something Dad would have said. Uncle Greg grinned back. So, what do you say? You ready for a little adventure? I thought about the empty house waiting for me, about Samantha's smirk and Mom's dismissive words. I thought about how long I'd spent feeling like an afterthought, like my needs didn't matter. Then I looked at Uncle Greg and nodded. Yeah, let's do it. We drove back to the house in silence. My stomach was in knots, but it wasn't the same kind of dread I'd felt before. This was different. It was like the beginning of something new, something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but something I knew I needed. When we pulled into the driveway, Uncle Greg turned to me. You don't have to say anything to them if you don't want to. I'll handle it. I nodded, gripping the door handle. Okay. We walked into the house together, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking into a trap. I felt like I was walking out of one. The drive to Uncle Greg's house was quiet. I watched the familiar streets of Willow Creek blur past through the car window, trying to process everything that had just happened. My heart was still racing from leaving the house, but it wasn't panic I felt. It was relief. Uncle Greg lived a little outside of town, in a small, cozy house with a big yard and a porch swing. It wasn't fancy, but it felt warm and lived in, like a home should. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt a knot in my chest start to loosen. You hungry again? Greg asked as he grabbed his duffel bag. I shook my head. No, I'm good. Suit yourself. Come on in, kiddo. The inside of his house was exactly how I remembered it. A little messy, with stacks of magazines on the coffee table and framed pictures lining the walls. Some of him and my dad, others of our family from years ago. I stopped in front of a photo of me and Dad sitting in front of a bonfire when I was about 10. My hair was messy, and my dad had this huge smile on his face like he'd just told a joke. Uncle Greg noticed me looking. That was a good day, he said quietly. Your dad couldn't stop talking about how you roasted the perfect marshmallow. I smiled a little, my throat tightening. Yeah. He was always so proud of the dumbest little things I did. That's because he loved you more than anything, Greg replied. He'd be proud of you now, too. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and kept looking at the photos. Greg let me settle in for a bit while he set up the spare bedroom for me. It was small, just a twin bed and an old desk shoved into the corner, but it was perfect. Make yourself at home, he said, standing in the doorway. You're welcome here as long as you need, okay? Thanks, Uncle Greg, I said quietly. He gave me a soft smile. Anytime, kid. That night, we ate dinner together, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, because Greg wasn't exactly a gourmet chef, and sat on his porch as the sun set. It was peaceful, the only sounds coming from the crickets and the occasional car driving by. So, Greg said after a while, you got any plans for after high school? I laughed a little. Not really. Mom says we can't afford college, so I'm just trying to figure it out. He turned to look at me, his brows furrowing. She told you that? Yeah, I said, shrugging. She's been saying it for a while now. I mean, I know things have been tight since Dad passed, so I didn't really question it. Greg frowned, leaning back against the porch railing. Anna, what about your college fund? I froze. My what? Your college fund? Greg repeated, his voice careful. Your dad set it up when you were born. He talked about it all the time. He was so proud of having a plan for your future. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Uncle Greg, there's no college fund. Mom said there was never any money for that. He sat up straighter, his expression darkening. That doesn't make any sense. I know for a fact your dad set one up. I helped him with the paperwork, and he made me promise to keep an eye on it in case anything happened to him. I felt like the ground had just dropped out from under me. Are you serious? Greg nodded. Yeah, I am. And now I'm wondering where that money went. My chest tightened, and my mind started racing. If Dad really did set up a college fund for me, then what happened to it? Why hadn't Mom ever mentioned it? Greg stood up suddenly, his face set. We're going to figure this out right now. I blinked. What do you mean? Come on, he said, heading inside. Grab your laptop if you've got one. We're going to find that account. We spent the next 2 hours at his kitchen table, surrounded by his old paperwork and my laptop open in front of us. Greg still remembered enough of the account details to give us a starting point. At first, I thought this whole thing was a dead end, some kind of mistake, but then we found it. A bank account in my name. Greg leaned over my shoulder as I pulled it up, his voice low. There it is. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My dad had really done it. He'd set aside money for me, a way for me to go to college, to have a future. But when I looked at the balance, my heart sank. The account was nearly empty. I stared at the screen, my chest tight. Where's all the money? Greg's expression darkened as he clicked through the account history. The withdrawals started not long after my dad passed away. Small amounts at first, then larger and larger ones. There were dates, names of stores and vendors listed, places I recognized. Designer boutiques, travel agencies, ticket vendors, Samantha's concert tickets, Samantha's clothes, Samantha's trips. I felt sick. Greg was muttering curses under his breath as he kept scrolling. This is unbelievable. Your mom's been draining this account for years. This money was supposed to be for you, Anna. My hands were shaking as I looked at the evidence in front of me. She used it all on Samantha. Greg stopped scrolling and looked at me, his jaw tight. Yeah, she did. I pushed back from the table, my heart pounding. I couldn't believe it. All those times Mom told me we didn't have enough money, all the times I asked for art supplies or help with school stuff, and she told me I'd have to figure it out on my own. It was a lie. The money was there. It was mine, and she spent it on Samantha. Tears burned in my eyes, but I blinked them back. I didn't want to cry. I was too angry to cry. Greg put a hand on my shoulder, his voice softer now. Listen to me, Anna. Your dad worked hard to give you a future, and she had no right to take that away. You don't have to let this go. What do you mean? I asked, my voice small. I mean, we're going to confront her, Greg said firmly. We'll get a lawyer if we have to. She doesn't get to sweep this under the rug. I swallowed hard, staring at the screen in front of me. A part of me didn't want to believe it. This was my mom. She was supposed to protect me, not steal from me. But the truth was right there. I looked up at Greg, my voice shaking. Okay, let's do it. He gave me a nod. Good. We'll handle this together, kiddo. I promise. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Uncle Greg wasted no time. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of him pacing in the kitchen. He was on the phone, his voice low but sharp. I don't care how awkward it gets, Margaret. We need to talk. No, I'm not dropping this. I froze in the doorway, still half asleep. He glanced at me and gave a small nod before lowering his voice even more. Fine. See you at my place in an hour. He hung up, his jaw clenched like he was holding back something bitter. She's on her way, he said, turning to me. I felt my stomach twist. You called her? Damn right I did, he replied, pouring himself another cup of coffee. This has gone on long enough. You deserve answers, Anna, and she's going to give them to you. I wasn't sure I was ready. Just the thought of facing my mom made my hands clammy. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. Would she yell? Would she cry? Would she deny everything? Greg must have noticed my hesitation because he leaned against the counter and looked at me. Calmer now. You don't have to do this alone. I'll be right there with you. But if you don't want to talk, you don't have to. I'll handle it. I swallowed hard and nodded. No, I need to do this. I need her to hear me. The hour passed faster than I wanted it to. By the time Margaret's car pulled into Uncle Greg's driveway, I felt like I was going to be sick. I stood by the window and watched her step out of the car. She looked like she hadn't slept, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her face pinched with stress. Greg stood next to me, arms crossed. Ready? Not really, but I nodded anyway. When Greg opened the door, Mom walked in like she was bracing herself for a fight. Her eyes immediately found me. Anna, she said, her voice soft. What's going on? Why are you here? Greg didn't let her finish. Sit down, Margaret, he said, his voice firm. She turned to him, frowning. Greg, I don't understand what this is about. You drag me out here like. You know exactly what this is about. Greg cut her off. He gestured toward the kitchen table where my laptop was already set up. We found the account. The one Tom set up for Anna. Margaret froze, her face going pale. I watched her carefully, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, she sank into one of the chairs and looked at me. Anna, it's not what you think. I felt a flash of anger in my chest. Then tell me what it is. Because from where I'm standing, you stole from me. Anna, I didn't steal. Stop, I said sharply, cutting her off. I could hear my voice shaking, but I didn't care. I'd been quiet for so long, and I wasn't going to back down now. That money was supposed to be for me. Dad worked hard for it, and you spent it all. On Samantha. She flinched at Samantha's name, her hands tightening in her lap. It wasn't like that. Your sister needed things, Anna. We were struggling, and she what? I snapped, my voice rising. She needed designer clothes? Concert tickets? Vacations? Are you kidding me? Margaret looked at me like I'd slapped her. For the first time, I could see guilt on her face, and it made me even angrier. She knew. She knew exactly what she'd done, and she couldn't even defend it. You always put her first, I said, my voice trembling. Always. You left me alone on my birthday, so you could take her to some stupid concert, and you spent my money to do it. Do you know how that feels? Do you even care? Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Uncle Greg stepped in, his voice low but cutting. You had no right, Margaret. That money was for Anna's future. Tom made sure of it. He trusted you to take care of it, and you betrayed that trust. Margaret turned to him, looking defensive again. I didn't plan for it to happen like this, Greg. I was trying to keep everything together. You don't know what it's been like, raising 2 kids on my own. Greg didn't flinch. Don't try to justify it. If you needed help, you should have asked. Instead, you spent every dime of that fund on one kid while ignoring the other. That's not parenting, Margaret. That's favoritism. She turned back to me, her voice cracking. Anna, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just thought. You thought I'd figure it out because I'm the strong one, I said bitterly. That's what you always say, isn't it? Anna doesn't need anything because Anna can handle herself. She dropped her gaze, staring at the table like she couldn't bear to look at me. Greg let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke again. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay that money back, every last cent of it. If you can't do it all at once, we'll set up a payment plan with a lawyer. But you're going to make this right. Margaret looked up sharply. A lawyer? Greg, that's not necessary. This is a family matter. No, Margaret, Greg said, his tone cold. This stopped being just a family matter the second you decided to steal from your own kid. You're lucky Anna's willing to give you the chance to pay it back. Otherwise, we'd be in court already. I watched as my mom's shoulders sagged, and for a second, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I thought about all the times I'd asked her for things. Art supplies, field trip fees, new shoes, and how she told me we couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, Samantha had everything handed to her on a silver platter. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Fine, she said quietly. If that's what you want, I'll pay it back. I don't know how yet, but I will. Greg nodded, satisfied. Good. I'll have a lawyer draw up the agreement. You'll stick to it, or there will be consequences. I didn't say anything. I just stared at her, waiting to feel something. Relief, satisfaction, anything. But all I felt was tired. Margaret looked at me, her face filled with guilt. I really am sorry, Anna. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you. I held her gaze and said the one thing I'd been holding in for years. You didn't bother to realize. That was the truth. She didn't see me because she never tried to. She left a few minutes later, quiet and defeated. I watched her car disappear down the road, then turned back to Uncle Greg. You okay, kiddo? He asked gently. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay yet. I think so. Greg put a hand on my shoulder. You did good. Your dad would be proud of you. His words hit me hard, and for the first time that day, I felt tears sting my eyes. Thanks, Uncle Greg. He gave my shoulder a squeeze. Come on, let's get some lunch. You've earned it. As we walked back inside, I knew things weren't fixed, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking back control. And that was enough for now. The house was quiet after my mom left, and for a long time, I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where she'd been. I thought confronting her would feel like a victory. I imagined yelling, watching her crumble under the weight of the truth, and walking away feeling free. But instead, I just felt empty. Uncle Greg let me sit there for a while without saying anything. He moved around the kitchen, clearing off papers and pouring himself another cup of coffee. Finally, he leaned against the counter and looked at me. You're thinking too much, he said. I looked up at him. How do you know? Because you're sitting there like someone just pulled the rug out from under you, he replied. You're trying to figure out how you're supposed to feel about all of this. He was right. I didn't know how to feel. Angry? Sad? Relieved? Maybe all of it. Maybe none of it. I just don't get it, I muttered. Why would she do this? Didn't she think I'd find out eventually? Greg sighed and walked over to the table, sitting down across from me. Sometimes people make terrible choices because they think they're doing the right thing. Other times, they just stop thinking altogether. Maybe she convinced herself it was okay because Samantha needed those things more. Maybe she thought you'd never notice. But that doesn't make it okay, I said, my voice hard. No, Greg agreed. It doesn't. For a moment, we sat in silence. Then Greg pushed his chair back and stood up. Come on, he said. We're getting out of here. Where are we going? You'll see. He drove us into town, stopping at a little hardware store I hadn't been to in years. My dad used to bring me here on weekends to pick up supplies for whatever DIY project he was obsessed with at the time. Walking inside, the smell of sawdust and paint brought back a wave of memories so strong it nearly knocked me over. "Why are we here?" I asked as Greg grabbed a cart. He grinned. "Because we've got a project to do." "A project?" Greg grabbed a small can of white paint and a roll of painter's tape, tossing them into the cart. "You'll see." I didn't ask any more questions. I just followed him through the aisles, watching as he picked up brushes, sandpaper, and a pack of nails. 20 minutes later, we were back in his truck, heading to his house with supplies in the back. When we pulled into the driveway, Greg turned to me and said, "We're fixing up your room." "My room?" He nodded. "That spare room I stuck you in. It's fine, but it's not yours yet. You're gonna make it yours." I stared at him, not sure what to say. "Why?" "Because you need something to focus on," he said. "Something that's yours. Something you can look at and say, 'I did that.' Trust me, it helps." Greg was right. We spent the whole afternoon working on the room. I sanded down the desk in the corner, taking off years of old paint while Greg patched holes in the wall and prepped the trim for painting. By the time the sun started to set, my hands were sore, my hair was full of dust, and my face was streaked with paint. And for the first time in days, I felt lighter. Greg leaned against the doorframe, wiping sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. "Not bad for day one," he said. I looked around the room and felt a small sense of pride. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. "Tomorrow we'll get some shelves put up," Greg added. "You can put your sketchbooks up there. Maybe some art supplies. Make it feel like yours." I smiled. "Thanks, Uncle Greg." He shrugged. "Anytime, kid." That night, after dinner, we sat on the porch again. The stars were out, and the air was cool. I had a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, sipping tea while Greg sat next to me, nursing a beer. "You thought any more about college?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated, staring down at my mug. "Yeah. I mean, I want to go. I just don't know how it's going to work." Greg nodded slowly. "Well, we've got that payment plan from your mom now. It's going to take her a while to pay back what she owes, but that money will come back to you. In the meantime, I'll help you figure it out. I've got some savings. It's not much, but it's a start." I looked at him, surprised. "You do that?" "Of course," he said. "You're my niece. Your dad would want me to help." My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard. "Thanks," I said quietly. Greg looked at me, his expression soft. "Anna, you're going to be okay. You've been through a lot, but you're tougher than you think. And you're not alone, no matter how it's felt these past few years." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For a long time, we just sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Over the next few days, things started to feel normal, or at least as normal as they could. I spent my mornings working on the room, painting the walls a soft, calming blue and organizing my art supplies. Greg brought me to a local art shop downtown, where he introduced me to the owner, a woman named Nancy. "She's looking for some part-time help," Greg told me on the drive over. "Thought you might want to check it out." I did. Nancy was kind and enthusiastic, and by the end of the conversation, I had my first real job. It wasn't much, just a few shifts a week, but it was something. It was mine. In the evenings, Greg and I sat on the porch or watched old movies. We talked a lot about Dad, things I'd forgotten, stories I'd never heard, and slowly, piece by piece, it felt like I was starting to remember who I was. One evening, a week after I'd confronted Mom, Greg handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it." I did. Inside was a check, a gift from my grandparents on my dad's side. "They wanted to help you get started," Greg explained. "They're proud of you, kid." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. For so long, I'd felt like I had no one. But here was proof that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I looked up at Greg, my voice thick. "Thank you for everything." He smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me something." "What?" "Keep going," he said. "Go to college. Chase what you love, and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't matter ever again." I nodded, a tear slipping down my cheek. "I promise." It's been a few weeks since all of this happened. Mom's first payment came in a few days ago, just a small amount, but it's a start. I haven't heard from Samantha, and honestly, I don't think I want to. For the first time in my life, I've stopped worrying about what they think of me. Greg and I are looking at colleges now. I'm not sure where I'll end up, but that doesn't scare me as much as it used to. I'm building a life for myself, piece by piece, and I finally feel like I'm heading somewhere that's mine. I still miss Dad every day, but I think he'd be proud of me. And that's enough for now.